Welcome, everyone. This is When Moses Went Up to Heaven, Rabbinic Tales of Matan Torah with Miss Miriam Gedwiser. This is the first session of this class as part of Drisha's Sfira Zman. What happened at Mount Sinai and why? Although the Torah has a lot to say, there's also a lot unknown. In this course, we will study Aggadot about Matan Torah, unpacking how the rabbis read this pivotal moment and what that says about them and us. This class, for those who have not had the pleasure of learning, this class is taught by Ms. Miriam Gedwiser. She teaches Talmud at the Ramaz Upper School and is a longtime faculty member at Drisha. She has a BA in the history, philosophy, and social studies of science and medicine from Chicago and studied law at NY School of Law. She has also learned in Midrashet Lindenbaum, Drisha Scholars Circle, and at the International Halacha Scholars Program. She has written widely on topics of Jewish and Torah interest, including for the Lohr House, The Forward, and Project 929. Thank you, and it's a pleasure teaching here again. Just a housekeeping note, if you are tuning in on Zoom and Facebook, please ask questions. We want to hear your questions. If you are a panelist, you can turn on your camera and you can unmute yourself, and more importantly, ask these questions directly. If you can't, you don't want to, that's not your style, or you are on Facebook, you can ask what you are welcome to ask questions in chat, and I will bring them to Ms. Gedwiser's attention. And source sheets will be posted in chat in a few minutes once things get underway, and they will also likely be shared on screen. And this is the first class of 3, and I hope to end. So let's get started.
Great, thank you so much, Kayla. Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thanks for coming. I thought I got to this topic for 2 reasons. One is that, well, the first reason is that we're in the period of Sfira where we're sort of preparing between Pesach and Shavuot. Shavuot we identify as the holiday of Matan Torah. So I thought this would be a way to sort of help in that preparation or engage in that preparation. It also happens that there's some wild and wonderful Aggadot. I wish that I wrote wildly instead of widely. That would be so fun. But there's some wonderful Aggadot, which I hope we'll talk about maybe the next 2 classes. I'm going to give a little background as to how I got to what I'm going to do today, because maybe it's instructive, maybe not. There's a long passage of Aggadot. From when I started thinking about this class, I was like, this is obviously where you start, is in Shabbat 88. There's a long passage of Aggadot about Matan Torah, some of which some of you may recognize when we get to them, and like a whole string of sort of what happened in Matan Torah, who did what we'll see. It starts because of a machloket in Masechet Shabbat about when Matan Torah happened, right? I just said unproblematically that Shavuot is the date of Matan Torah. It's actually not the opinion of all of the Tanaim. There's a machloket between the rabbis and I believe Rabbi Yossi about whether Matan Torah happened on the 6th of Sivan or the 7th of Sivan. So that's an interesting question. We learn, in contemporary Jewish life, everyone says the 6th because I guess we follow the rabbis. So they have this disagreement, and they're bringing all these different proofs from back and forth in the Torah. What is it? How does the sequence work, and what day, and then also what day of the week is it? So there's a bunch of questions like that, which I have not and do not intend to unpack fully with you. It's actually sort of weirdly technical, but I wanted to just sort of start almost like at the beginning, to make sort of an exegetical point to show how they read, how the rabbis in that passage segue from this technical, what day did what happen and how many days were there, what day of the week was it, all this stuff, into some more deep points, I would say, about Matan Torah. And I want to just begin at the sort of the moment that I think that happens, that segue happens from how are we going to prove, at least for me, seeing it laid out this way kind of struck me as I hadn't thought about it that way. And then I collected, in terms of how they, basically, if the rabbis are going to summarize what did Moshe do and when, all of a sudden it will raise something, I think, for us. So we'll see that in a second. I have a question. If anybody, I know this is not all the panelists, but if anybody has, and you can make me stop asking questions by not answering them, but it would be better if you answer them and then I'll keep asking them. If we think about the moment of Matan Torah, where is Moshe? Right.
Isn't he with the people? Because if we don't, we need him to be there because he's the conduit.
Okay, right? He has to be there because he's the conduit. So what's he doing?
Oh, like, is he actively teaching? Is the Torah a physical object, a la the two Luchot? Is this something else?
Yeah, yeah. I guess like what's meaning certainly for Anochi Hashem, I didn't bring this for you, but right, the classic idea is that God just sort of said it, right? So Moshe is the conduit. I don't know. Maybe this is just me. I have read this many times, but I guess Kayla reads it more carefully than me. But sometimes you think of Moshe as kind of like going a go-between or something, or maybe sometimes we think of him as up on the mountain receiving. That actually comes later. So I just wanted to sort of I wanted to start with this Gemara, and I guess I'll just go there before I talk too much more about it. So I will share the same document that you
So
have.
where else could Moshe be? But like,
Moshe should be on the mountain.
but then how could they hear him and
How could
say,
they hear him?
"Oh, it's too much for us, go away."
Yeah,
And talk
no, I
about-
guess that's true. I guess that's true. Yeah. So that's gonna yes. So you guys all read Tanakh more carefully than I am. What can I say? I think that's true, right? He has to be, but I don't know. There's something about, well, maybe I'll defend myself in a second. But let me find. Here it is. Okay. I'm going to share this document that we're all maybe looking at. So this is the begin, sort of the transitional portion of this Aggadot. So it starts like this, right? Tashma, we're going to try and prove, right? Like, how did Moshe go up? This is the opinion of Rabbi Yossi, but and how does it work with the rabbis? So Rabbi Yossi is one who thinks it's the seventh, right? Tashma, right? We can learn Risha, and I just thought the way it was summarized just sort of like struck me. I know usually like my thought process is not necessarily instructive for you, but bear with me, right? B'sheni ala Moshe v'yarad. On the second day of Sivan, Moshe went up and then came back down. B'shlishi ala v'yarad. On the third, he went up and came back down. B'revi'i yarad v'shuv lo ala. And then on the fourth, he came down and he didn't go back up again. Right? Those of us who followed elementary physics may wonder that when did he go up, that he came down? So the Gemara also wonders that. Right? If he hadn't gone up yet, how could he come down? Right? You said he went up, down, down. Well, where's he coming down from? So on the fourth day, he also went up and came back down. And then on the fifth, on the fifth, he built an altar. And he brought a sacrifice. And on the sixth, he didn't have time. My love, Mishum Torah, isn't the fact that he didn't have time because that's the day of Matan Torah? Lo Mishum Torah Shabbat. Maybe the other opinion could explain, no, it's not because that's the day of Matan Torah, it's because that's the day, sorry, it must not be Rabbi Yossi. Anyways, set aside who's who, right? That's not because that's the day of Matan Torah, it's because that was Shabbat, so he couldn't go up to heaven. Or sorry, for preparing for Shabbat, and Shabbat is the next day. Okay, so I just thought what I liked about this, first of all, this is still part of the technical, like what day did Matan Torah happen discussion. And it's about, I just thought like setting it out this way is like Moshe's going up and down, up and down, up and down. We know that. We'll see it soon in Shemot 19. Although, if you notice for a second, not everything here is from Shemot 19, which is an interesting fact. But Shemot 19 is is kind of like the chapter of the preparation for Matan Torah. That's what I want to think about kind of today. Like, what are the prerequisites for actually having this encounter? How does it work? So here Moshe is kind of shuttling back and forth, which is true in the Torah, right? He shuttles back and forth, and then he doesn't go back up again until after the Torah is received. Seeing it laid out that way, kind of like, I mean, I think many of us may know if you follow the parsha, whatever, that Moshe goes back and forth, but seeing it laid out this way made me also feel like it's a little bit, the words that are coming to me are kind of have a negative connotation, which is not what I'm thinking, but there's some sort of hesitancy or difficulty in this approach, right? You can't just go up. You have to go up, it's kind of a negotiation. It's not necessarily a negotiation, we'll see in Rashi in a second. Maybe we'll look at Rashi now, right? It's not like a negotiation of like the people like are different demands from different sides, but it's kind of like information has to be conveyed, and it's being conveyed in a kind of piecemeal way, right? And that's what I thought was interesting about this, that this opening of this very long sugya, it's like 2 pages, which, like I said, contains other things about like what's actually going to happen during the moment of Matan Torah. What does Moshe see when he gets to heaven, which is the source of this the name of this course. We'll talk about those, God willing. But even before that, right, like, what's the process of quote unquote getting to heaven like? And it feels a little bit like you can't just go, right? You have to sort of go and come and try and bridge a gap with a little bit of a back and forth movement. So Rashi kind of explains what's behind this. Shani Ela Moshe, right? He heard Atem Tiyuli. Atem Tiyuli meaning the end of that pasuk is Mamlechet Kohanim v'Goy Kadosh. You will be for me a kingdom, a priest, and a holy nation. That's kind of God's like offer, or what God is saying. This is what's going to happen. I'm going to give this to you, and this will give you the status. That's from Shemot Yud Tet, which we'll see momentarily. Just for like a recap of the Parakim of Shemot. Shemot Yud Zayin is Amalek attack. Shemot Yud Chet is Yitro arrive. Shemot Yud Tet is this entirely the preparation for theophany, fancy word for Matan Torah, right? And then Shemot Chaf is Anochi Hashem, basically. Okay, so then on the third he went up and he, right, Shema Hagbala Ve'yarad, that you can't come near the mountain, right? But Barivi'i Yarad Lahafrisham, and then the next message is that they have to stay away from their spouses. And then he didn't go up until he received the Dibrot. And the fifth, he built the altar. The source for building the altar is Exodus 24, right? So that's something I'm not going to talk about, but it's just something to know, right? There's another narrative about sort of like the circumstances of encountering God and what happens, and it ends with this sort of cryptic thing of they saw the glory of God. Maybe we'll come back to it another time, but there's this other narrative that happens in the Torah after the Seret Dibrot. Rashi and the Gemara are pretty clear that they think that in Mukdam Mochar Torah here, right? That narrative actually happened before. Many of us accept that because that's where the phrase Na'aseh V'nishma comes. So that's sort of like in the popular Jewish mind, those 19 and 24 kind of melded, right? I believe that's where Na'aseh V'nishma happens. Fine. So that's sort of where we are. We're going to look at Shemot 19, and the second part of this Gemara I want to look at when we do that. In order to look at Shemot 19, just to see, and what I'm looking for is this kind of back and forth, and I'm going to hopefully be showing other Aggadot and commentaries that kind of pull that out as well, right? This idea that like it's not so straightforward to just like hear from God, as some of you mentioned, right? Like later on, they're like, oh, that was too much. That's true, right? It could be too much, but it's also like even just the process of getting there the first time is a little bit. It's difficult. It's windy a little bit. It's not just direct. So let me, I wanted to show this awesome tool, which I'm sure many of you have seen, called, right, this is just a nice way of looking at words. Here we are. Let's see. So this is a Tanakh lab from Matan Torah. Some of my Tanakh teacher colleagues are like obsessed with Matan Torah. They think it's the best thing ever. I personally use Sefaria a lot, but for things like this, Matan Torah is amazing. And we have a color-coded thing on the side, as you can see. So this is all chapter 19. And you can like hover over a word and it will show you what that word is. Everybody can see what I'm looking at, right? And I thought this was interesting because, and then they have various ways of showing you which words are more and less important. So I thought, right, I have this midrash that's talking about going up and going down. Let's look for going up and going down. So we see over here the way they've sort of ranked it. Yarad appears kind of like fifth on this list. If you look at, I'm gonna click on Baketa, which is how many times a word appears in this unit, right? So I think it's kind of interesting, right? I think they take out like et and other like sort of prepositions, things like that. The most common word is right? The nation, which is kind of interesting, right? The promise is you're going to become a kingdom, a priest, and a holy nation. The mountain, the central location. Right after that, we have these two verbs, Allah and Yarad, right? And we can sort of click on them and see where they appear. And they appear at these magical numbers of time, 8, which is one more than 7, and 7, which is a lot. And this is right then in these columns. I don't know if people have used this before, but whatever. It tells you like how much more common it is in this section than in other places. But anyway, those are our interesting things. Anywho, so yeah, if we wanted to do it differently, right? How relevant, I'm just going to show you this now. I'll come back to the Allah Yarad in a second. For example, how common is something in this passage relative to how common it is in Tanakh? The most common thing is 3, right? Vayom Hashlishi, all of this stuff. right, in the third month, be ready for the third day, right? All of that. If you look at the passage, it's not really related to the theme I wanted to bring out. I just thought it was cute, right? The next thing in that Gemara is somebody, a certain Galilean who says, right, blessed is God who gave the three-part people, well, I'll just go back to it for a second. Right. The Galilean taught, right? Blessed is the merciful one who gave a threefold Torah, Torah Nevi'im Ketuvim, to the threefold people, Kohanim, Levim, Yisraelim, by a third-born Moshe on the third day, right, in the third month, right? And that also actually has something to do with which opinion about when Matan Torah happened. But right, it's not actually out of nowhere, right? Like when I first read it, I was like, that's cute, right? But it actually is responsive to the fact that the passage seems very interested in the number 3. In any case, right, if we look back at our Alan Yarad, Moshe goes up, and you can kind of, right, Moshe goes up. Then we have God says, I am going to come down, right? You should not come up, right? That's sort of, if we just sort of trace this, in this time, Moshe Allah El Eloi, Moshe went up to God, God called out to him, gave him this message, right? You've seen everything I've done. You're going to be Mamlechet Kohanim V'Goy Kadosh. You're going to be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation for me. And here's what you should tell Bnei Israel. Now doesn't actually have the word Yarad, which is maybe why Yarad appears one less time than Allah, right? Moshe came and called to the elders of Israel. He told them all this stuff. And they said, Kol asher diber Hashem na'aseh, right? Everything that God has said, we will do, not we will do and listen. Moshe returned their words to God. Then God says to Moshe, I'm coming to you in the big cloud, right? They're going to believe in me and you. And Hashem says to Moshe, go tell the people that they should prepare themselves and wash their garments, and they should be ready for the third day, because on the third day, God's glory will come down. They should not come up, right? And afterwards, they can come up. Then Moshe comes down with that second message, right? Moshe, and he told them to prepare themselves, right? And then on the third day, there's all this big noise and all that stuff. Moshe took the people out. They stood at the bottom of the mountain. We will come back to that, right? That phrase a lot, right? Even just the idea, by the way, of mountain is a thing that goes up and down, right? It's sort of like it has a bottom and a top, and there's like a distance between them, right? The whole city, right? God has in fact come down. The smoke is going up. God comes down. And Moshe goes up. Moshe goes up, and he says, "Go tell them not to touch the mountain, right? Right, that not to try and see what they shouldn't see." And Moshe says, "Don't worry, they can't even come up because we already made a border." So then God says, "Okay, go down, right? But everybody else shouldn't come up." And then Moshe came down and told them, right? And then what comes next is, right? So this is actually like a strange pasuk by Yom Aleichem, because usually you would expect a quote to come afterwards, and it doesn't. But then you have, and God said to them, Anochi Hashem. So there is like there's a few things I think to notice. One is that these words appear a lot because they're talking about what God is going to do. God is going to come down to the mountain. The smoke is going to go up. But there's also a little bit of a strangeness about what Moshe does, right? For example, the last thing God says is, right, the people can't come up, go down, right? And then you and Aharon will come up. So there's some level where Moshe is distinct from the people, right? He's a little bit of the go-between. But the last thing that happens is, like in the Gemara, Moshe went down, right? Moshe went down and he didn't come back up again, meaning until after the Aseret HaDibros, right? So Moshe went down, but there with this, it's left here with like, but he's supposed to go. He just received an instruction to go up, but he went down, he did the thing, and that instruction will be carried out later in some way. I don't know if anyone has other observations about this passage, but I just thought it was kind of, like I said, right? I'm a little recreating my thought process in a way that maybe also, first of all, shows some methodology, but also like, it's kind of things that we see, but maybe don't always notice. Maybe you do notice them. I don't know. Good if you notice them. I'm happy for you, but I don't always. So I'm not sure about the equal responsibility, though there is actually Judith Plaskow has something interesting to say about that. But right there is some way that going up and coming down is like one of the central dramas of this chapter, right? And this like little pithy description, which is really supposed to be about when did it all happen, pulls up on that way. He went up, he went down, he went up, he went down, he went down without going up. That's weird. Maybe he went up without going down, right? So there's something happening with these things. And I wanted to sort of look at a few Aggadot that might not be specifically about those words, but are again responsive to those themes. I think that is a way to think about it. Okay. Just in case we were not sure about this, Maharal kind of beats us over the head with it. Maharal, not really a midrash, but kind of in the vein of midrash, right? He's a medieval guy. Midrash, he quotes a midrash from Yalkut Shimoni, which is a late midrash anyway. Moshe Allah el ha'Elohim, right? What's this like? Mashal lemelech shemisi et bito. A king is marrying off his daughter. Who's the daughter, by the way?
Torah?
Yeah, the Torah is the daughter, okay? Which is going to come up a lot, right? The Torah is kind of like, it's born in heaven, but it's being given over to the earth. So previously,
that's not really the wedding. I feel like that's not the popular kind of Shavuot wedding analogy that is floating around. Anyways, continue.
Say more. Why not?
I've heard more. Matan Torah is the wedding. Har Sinai is the chuppah, and Matan Torah and the Torah is the ketubah.
Correct. Right. The Torah could be the ketubah. God is the chatan. Often it's not God marrying the Torah; it's God marrying Bnei Israel. And we're going to see that actually in the Gemara that comes up. But this is kind of an interesting thing where like the Torah is he's going to show exactly why that's an interesting analogy. You're right. It's not the only way or even the typical way necessarily that we see it.
May I just bring in two questions that came up in chat?
Please.
Miriam Smirnoff asks, is Midrash canonized to a certain time? You mentioned that Maharal can't write Midrash because he's medieval.
So the answer is yes and no. I actually forget exactly when. So, okay. I have many things to say about that. I used to be like, yeah, for sure. First of all, a few things. We have Midrash, we have things that are called books of Midrash that are from a wide variety of time. For example, Yalkut Shimoni, I think, is a pretty late digest. Shemot Rabbah, I actually learned recently, is like never quoted by Rashi because it wasn't canonized at that time, right? Like I personally believe, and I think I'm not a scholar of these things, first of all, I should say. I think there's good evidence that like a lot of the material in some of these things may be older. Breishi Rabbah, for example, seems to be like almost Tannaitic, right? So there's a wide range in books that we call Midrash. I don't think that, what I mean by that is that Maharal is self-aware that he's not a Midrash. Meaning, can you write modern Midrash, for example? I think by the time of Maharal, the books that we call Midrash were generally closed. In terms of the genre of Midrash, I think there's a lot of people who are doing similar things. But what sets them apart from Midrash, to me, maybe the reason I said that, is that they're aware that they're not Midrash. For example, they'll quote a Midrash and then say, what this Midrash means is X, which he's about to do right now, right? As opposed to a midrash, which will quote a pasuk and say, this is what this pasuk means. But later on, like Rishonim and Achronim can do that also. They can also explain pasukim, but they're self-aware about being in the layer in addition to midrash, as opposed to being the first layer of interpretation, if that makes sense.
And just another question from a little earlier, also from Miriam's asking, pointing out kind of first source, equal responsibility to cook and clean between husband and wife, and responsibility your wife respond. It's, I think, referring to the last line of that you quote, the last
line for Shabbat.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, that's how I think actually, like, it's a good point. It's not really for this class, but the question of like gender and Shabbat preparation, I think I'm not sure that I would say that in the Talmud it's always equal responsibility, but it is very interesting because, right, there's texts about sort of like, certain rabbi would always make sure to do X, Y, Z. He would sweep the floor. And it's sort of like, on the one hand, it's like, yeah, you should be involved. On the other hand, it's like, wow, you never sweep the floor. And today you're doing one thing and you want like a gold star. Yes, I think it's true, right? Like, and certainly descriptively, right? This is the idea of like people running around in the market trying to buy stuff before Shabbos. If you go to Teaneck, like if you go to Stop and Shop in Teaneck, where I live, like, an hour before Shabbos, you sort of see that it's mostly husbands, except for me, because usually my husband cooks. So I'm the one who goes, like, whoever is in charge of cooking is out buying like the last ingredient that people forgot, right? Like there certainly is that vibe, right? That everybody's involved. not necessarily, right, like they may have gender distinctions about what role there is, but everybody's kind of involved in getting ready for Shabbos. It's like that pre-Shabbos buzz that we also experience. So I think that's a nice thing to point out. Thank you. Okay. So here's what Maharal says, right? He quotes what he calls Midrash, right? Moshe went up to God, right? It's like the king is marrying his daughter. It used to be that there were norms, right? Kartisin is like, I mean, I don't know if it's related to our kartis, like a ticket, but right. Usually, b'nei Romi lo yachtu l'Surya, b'nei Surya lo yiskun l'Romi. That the people of Rome wouldn't go to Syria and vice versa, right? They're sort of like borders. You need a passport, right? Kivan shehisid bito he tirkach, right? But he permitted this kind of like international travel once his daughter got married. It sounds like maybe he's marrying his daughter to somebody from another province, right? Which is the kind of thing that people do for diplomatic reasons. So he, he's kind of like loosening some of the restrictions on travel. Right? And this is why it's a Midrash Antihil, right? Before the Torah was given, God is upstairs and people are downstairs. God gave the people the downstairs and God is in heaven and never the twain shall meet. Well, that was an overstatement, obviously, but you could imagine that, right? That these are kind of separate domains. When the Torah was given, this is actually from right before when the Torah was given, as we saw, right? There's fluidity or flexibility where both Moshe can go up to God and God can come down to Har Sinai, right? That even though the whole premise of the up and down in chapter 19 is that, right, God is up and Moshe is down, and Moshe, but this Midrash is noticing something interesting, which is that even though that's the premise, they can both travel, right? That Moshe can go up, that in fact it's possible to kind of meet, maybe even to cross paths, right? Each to enter the other domain in some way. There's like a really interesting study at the beginning of Masechet Sukkah about this, right? Does God really ever enter the world, the human domain? And there's tons of proof from the Torah. It sounds like God came down, right? And every time the Gemara was like, no, that must mean above 10 tvachim. What that means is like a great question, because presumably like God doesn't fully exist in space in the way that we talk about it that way. But right, this, and I think our texts about Matan Torah are saying like, no, there's like a blurring of this boundary. But I just want to point out that that's a blurring that can also cause discomfort, and maybe outside of the special one-time event of Matan Torah, people want to pull back from a little bit. So here's what Maharal says about this midrash. Right, the Torah is what causes. I've translated it as fusion. I should have said fusion instead of fusing, but we have our moments. Right, it causes fusion or connection between the upper and lower realms. Right, the Torah is from heaven, but is accepted or received by the people down below. It's as if they become fully one. Right, there's a lot of, God, Torah, and Israel are one is like a quote often from the Zohar. It's actually used to be like on a stained glass window in a conservative synagogue in Chicago when I went to school there, which is truly amazing. I thought that was like really like kind of a heavy thing to put on your stained glass window. But in any case, right, in some ways, this is sort of like a bird's eye and somewhat easy view of this process that the Torah is highlighting, and then the Gemara is highlighting, which is this up and down, back and forth. Is like actually like the Torah made it possible, and it's this like uncomplicated fusion, right? Like the Torah is the glue, and now God and Israel, or the heaven and earth, or Moshe and God, or something, are one. Okay, so that's a view. I think what's interesting is that there are, if you start to get into the weeds through other midrashim of that question of what does it mean to go up and down or back and forth, or kind of try and fuse two previously separate magisteria, two separate realms, right? What's that actually like? It's not so simple. It's not just like you're like this and now you're married, right? And in some ways, the marriage analogy is kind of interesting because marriage is also like that. On the one hand, like, yeah, there's a moment where it's like I do or whatever, that's the end. But there's also like, for those who have gotten married, right? There's transitional periods before and after. It's not always so simple to figure out like, how are you going to go from two separate people, households, identities to sort of like something together. So what I wanted to do for the remainder of the time is just to look at a few texts that are about that, about that uneasiness of that back and forth, going up and down and up and down, and what's happening in, not literally what's happening in between in terms of like those days of the month, but like what that is like, let's say. So I thought I would start with this Rashi's. Maybe we'll come back to Rashi after. Rashi here is heavily based on the Sifrei, which comes next in source 6. So let's go to source 6. Now, it could be that Rashi has done a great job for us by digesting the Sifrei, but I think that there's like a little more in it that maybe we can see. So here's the Sifrei. Sifrei is Midrash Sevarim, from Midbar and Devarim, but here it's Devarim. And again, right, I think this Sifrei is considered a relatively early Midrash, right? This is a book of Midrash, right? It's commentaries directly on the Torah, as opposed to later people who comment Midrash. Fine. So he said, Hashem Sinai ba'av v'zarach me'seir lamo. This is a quote from V'zot HaBracha. Some people may hear it many, many times on Simchas Torah. Right, what's this about? Right, and it seems like it's a poetic rendition of something that happened at Har Sinai. Hashem Sinai ba'av v'zarach me'seir lamo. Right, God came from Sinai and he shone out from Seir to them. Seir usually being like Edom. Hofia mehar Paran. He appeared from the mountain of Paran. This I didn't give you the pasuk. I'm sorry. Ve'atam erivut kodesh, and he arrived from the multitude, the holy multitudes. Mimino eshtad lamo. From his right is a eshtad. A good question how to translate it. But the holy fire, let's say, the fiery law for them, or maybe it's one word. We can. Maybe I'll just show it to you for a second. Fine, we can use Chabad. This opened for me, and I have not changed my default browser, obviously. Lama, right? He appeared from Mount Paran and came with some sort of holy myriads. His right hand was a fiery law for them, right? I just have a simple question, which is, where is God coming from in this verse? Okay, the Lord came from Sinai, from Seir, from Mount Paran, right? So this is the kind of verse that's very fruitful for Midrash, because like those are not actually all the same thing or the same place. Okay, so that's going to be something that we're going to see the Midrash deal with in multiple ways. Okay, you can follow along in the English on the side. I'm going to read and translate them. Magida katuv shekeshepatach Moshe lo patach b'tzarcham. The first thing, which Rashi also quotes, which I think is lo patach b'tzarcham shel Yisrael tchila ad shepatach b'shivcho shel makom. Right, in V'zot HaBracha, which is mostly about blessings for the tribes, first it mentions God. That's just a nice thing to do, right? Even if you're talking about the needs of Israel, you talk about God the partner first, because it's an unequal relationship in some ways. Something like right? And then it's going to end that way also by Vahi Bishur and Melech. And the next passages also talk about, which I skipped, talk about how this is the same as the Amidah. You talk about God, even though you talk about yourself in the middle, you talk about God at the beginning and the end. Also like a totally separate thing that I won't talk about, right, how I won't get into how the structure of prayer there are many things that seem to have parallel structure. The structure of prayer, maybe the structure of Mishkan, and the structure of Matan Torah are all meant to parallel each other. So here we go. That's the first thing, is we start talking about God, but I would say almost that the Midrash is doing the same thing. It says Moshe started talking about God, but then he really talks about Bnei Israel. The Midrash is going to start saying that, but then it's going to offer a bunch of other interpretations of the same verse that are really much more about Bnei Israel, or about our relationship to God and what it means to receive the Torah. So I love this translation variantly, right? An alternative, right? Right? What does it mean to say God came from Sinai? God came from 4 directions. Some people may have seen this before. Right? There's 4 things, right? It's a poetic structure. God came from X, Y, Z, A. 4, right? God came from 4 directions. And it gives a location for each of these things. They don't actually do Atam Rivot Kodesh, which is not a specific location. There's another pasuk that says God will come from Teman, and here in the translation they give a location or a language for each of these things. Looks like I probably put the wrong translation here, actually, because this is about directions. Sorry, not about languages. Yeah, I switched the translations for these two passages. That was a mistake. I'm sorry. Right. So the first thing is God came from 4 directions. Okay. The second thing, he said to them in 4 languages. And here, the same 4 psukim, right? Each of them is associated with a language, maybe of a people that lives in that direction. So these 2 things I think are companions, right? They're framed as Devar Hashem, but they're kind of companions. They have something in common, which is the idea that the revelation at Sinai has multiplicity in some way, right?
Interesting comment just came in from in the chat from Joyce Rubin that I want to highlight is that a statement that someone, quote, came from somewhere indicates that person was in a specific location, but God isn't limited to a specific location as we understand space and location.
Okay, that's great. So I would say a few things. First of all, the idea that when you say God is coming from 4 places at once, it's a little bit of a nod to that, which is that people usually don't come from 4 places at once. When to me, it's sort of opening that when we say God comes from anywhere, it's kind of a metaphor. So when we say God comes from 4 places at once, what does that mean? For example, if we say like God came from Jerusalem, I don't know if we ever say that. We usually say the Torah comes from Jerusalem. If we were to say that, we would automatically sort of understand it as a metaphor for something having to do with the relationship of this place to, or how it's a special place in our relationship with God, something like that. But here, when you say God comes from 4 places, it's a good point, right? What are you really saying? If you're not saying literally like God is divided, you divide God into 4 pieces, right? And then they kind of like they all come together, right? What's it saying? It's saying that the experience of Har Sinai, you could think of seeing it in a few ways. They don't have any thoughts on what's that saying about what does it mean to be there and feel like it's coming from all 4 places, from different directions, right? And by the way, 4 directions means all around, kind of everywhere. Or you could mean that, right? That's sort of what it stands for. If you think cartographically, I don't know if they always thought cartographically, but they certainly have the idea of our Baruch, right? The 4 directions. Right. Oh, so my question is, right? You can answer that. What does it mean? What could it be trying to say about the experience of receiving the Torah if you say that it's like experiencing God coming from 4 directions at once? Or similarly, 4 languages at once.
It kind of evokes the feeling of on Sukkot when you wave the lulav all around you. And it's a very like sensory feeling, sensual, whatever the word is. You can hear it, you can smell it, you can see it, it's kind of all around you. And so I guess that could be a metaphor for how we want to, have Torah be all around our lives.
Right. Okay. So I like a lot of things you said. First of all, I think there is some underlying sensuality in some of this, but even just right, the idea, it's very immersive, right? It's sort of like everywhere. It's not really a you and them anymore. Where like you're here. We're going to see later. It's like God is coming out to the chuppah, right? But it's not like that, where like you're here and God is there and you meet. It's like God is like coming in from all sides. It could be that like we aspire to some kind of like immersive totalizing experience once we have received the Torah, but right, I think there's also like a little bit more, which is you could be just a little overwhelming, right? That's one possible reading of it, is like it's really coming in on you from all sides. An alternative reading, which I want to say that I heard this from Ravia Bizomberg, but I don't remember because it was a long time ago. I did not check if she says this anywhere. Right. An alternative is not that it's really coming in from all sides, but that it's kind of like reverberating in different places, right? In a way that's a little more gentle, maybe, than kind of like, for example, we're going to see later, right? I'm going to smush you with the mountain. It's not that. One possibility is like it's really coming in, it's like being smushed by the mountain. And the other one is like, no, it's kind of like it can come from different places, different things, different people can access different parts of it, maybe, right? There certainly is an idea that if that's what it is, it's a very sort of like, I think a kind of reading that contemporary people might be drawn to, with like, like there's different elements of revelation that different people pick up, or that might sort of speak to different people differently. But there's something interesting about that, about this this idea that when later Moshe describes the revelation, it's describing God as coming from multiple directions or in multiple modalities. Right? But I'm using languages to think about modalities of kind of, right? On the one hand, it's very totalizing, but on the other hand, it means there's multiple access points. I guess that's what I would say. And to me, that feels a little bit like the Moshe as the go-between going back and forth, right? There's something not 100% straightforward about that encounter where it's just like, okay, I'm here, you're here, I'm going to tell you stuff, right? It's like, it doesn't work quite like that. It's like there needs to be a little bit of people need to find their place or their path in order to get that message. All right, here's our next Devar Acher, if I may. Devar Acher, Vayomer Hashem Sinai ba, Shenigla Kadosh Baruch Hu litain Torah l'Yisrael lo al Yisrael bilvad. And this is okay. I'd love to sing children's songs. It's like a problem that I have, but some people may know this one. It helps that I teach children who are much older than these songs are intended for, but they usually like it also. Right? Hashem gave us a present. Do you know what it was? He gave us the Torah so we could keep its laws. He asked the other nations, do you want this gift of mine? But they said, no, thank you for Torah. We've no time. I don't know if you know that song. But anyways, I'm sure you can have many feelings about what it means to teach that song to little children. But anyways, this is that midrash, right? God offered the Torah to all the nations. It appears also in Avodah Zarah, and perhaps elsewhere also in the Gemara, right? God was, and at first it sounds almost like this revelation is everywhere, right? It's in theory accessible to everyone, right? It's just out there. It's not exact. The way the Midrash is going to take it is going to be specific conversations with each nation, but okay, fine. So he went to the children of Esav, right? And it's interesting, right? There, everybody is described by their biblical ancestor because of what's the same pattern is going to repeat. So we'll read the first one and then you can fill it in for yourself if you want. He went to the Bnei Esav, Amar lahem mekablim temet Torah. He said, will you accept the Torah? Amru lo ma katuv ba. They said, well, what's in it? Right? And this is already the first point of contrast because the point is, right, he went, well, in the words of the song, then to Bnei Yisrael, Hashem did go. We said, Naseh v'nishma, because we love Hashem. So we didn't ask what's in it. We just took it, right? Even though, again, right, this uncomplicated idea, like Naseh v'nishma, what I'm trying to do today is a little bit complicated of like, yeah, they may have been fully willing, but there's still some stuff that has to happen to make that connection work. So he went to Bnei Esav. They said, well, what's in it? He said, lo tirtzach. And God always has the thing to tell them, either that God goes through stuff until they have a problem, or maybe God always tells them the one thing he knows, or God knows that they're going to have a problem with. He says, thou shalt not kill. They said, kol atzmam shelo tam anashim va'avihem rotzeachu. Now, obviously, this is like not how the actual children of Esav might self-conceptualize. They said, listen, like our whole way of being and our father, we're murderers, right? So that's like a little bit of obviously like sort of a projection maybe of how we see them or how the Jews at the time of this Midrash saw them, right? But there's a proof. Right? The hands are the hands of Esav. Esav lives by his hands and he lives by the sword, right? As an aside, right? There's something. I'll say it. Don't hate me. Right, the hands of Esav, right? This I think is the classical approach, right? Where like, you know, Esav lives by the sword, he gets his hands dirty, and the Jews live by the word, they live by the Torah, they don't get the right. We sort of were nonviolent, whatever. This is a conception that has that stark dichotomy, right? You know, like Jews don't have military power, which I think is really the way a lot of people might have thought about this for a long time, has become a challenging conception in the last 100 years. So that's like an interesting, how to think about Yaakov and Esav in an era of Zionism is an interesting question, which I'm working on actually in other contexts, but, or how people do think about it. I'm not prescribing, but how people do think about it. But like really for a long time, it was like Esav, these things belong to Esav, right? Swords belong to Esav, and we don't do that. And when Esav hears lo tirtzach, he's like, I can't do that because I live by the sword, right? So then God goes to Bnei Ammon, and basically every descendant of biblical character is like, listen, like the Torah says this thing about me that is incompatible with what you're telling me the Torah wants, which is kind of interesting because we often hear this midrash framed as, right, where does achar bracha techiyah? That's the bracha that Esav gets from Yitzchak, right? And the other ones, I mean, you can look at them, but the other ones are very similar, where it's something that according to the Torah is true about these people. It's not necessarily, it's often framed as a choice, right? They had a choice and they're like, no, we like killing people. That's not exactly what it's like here, right? It's not we like killing people. It's just like this Torah was obviously not written for us because we have a different set of instructions almost, right? Like our way of being is different than what this seems to be for. Which is also an interesting question as to like how sincere is this offer, right? Why is God doing this? Is God doing this later so they can't say you didn't give us a chance, but he knows they're going to say no? That's a little bit disingenuous. It's a good question why we want to say this, but right. We go through this whole thing of God sort of offered it to all these other nations, and that's why, right? It comes from this pasuk, right? Hashem mi seir ba, right? He came from Seir, from the children of Esav. He had just offered it to them, but they said no, so now he came to Bnei Israel. So it's sort of like in sequence. He had offered it to all these places, and then finally it gets to Bnei Israel, and they said no. Right? Right, and it's sort of like an extended disquisition on why the Jews are so much better for accepting the Torah. Right at the end, right, the sons of Noach couldn't even accept their 7 mitzvot, but the Jews accepted those plus all the others, and that's what the Hashem Sinai Ba means, which I think is a little different than the previous one, right? Hashem Sinai Ba before was kind of right. It's either overwhelming or it's kind of like different paths for different people. Here it is very particular, right? There may be different paths for different people, but it's not for everyone. There's work, or there's some sort of like, there's something that you have to be able to do about yourself. Bnei Israel do take up arms many times in the Torah narrative. I'm saying, just in response to the comment, that's true. First of all, I would say even in the Torah, there's interesting work to be done about exactly how it's described, Bichara versus Lefichara, that comes up with Bilam. But in terms of, let's say, post-exilic conceptions of the difference between Yaakov and Esav, which gets projected onto the difference between Judaism and Christianity, or Jews in Rome, or something like that, there's a lot of things there that I think require unpacking in the modern era. Right, so there's something here about, right, like it may be, Matan Torah is, I guess the word I keep looking for is a little bit uneasy. Right? It's on the one hand, uncomplicated Bnei Israel are all in, but on the other hand, there's a lot of stuff, there's a lot of building blocks that were required to get there, because the Midrash can imagine a bunch of people who would just be like, no, not for us. Right? And not for us because of the way that we're presented in the Torah, right? Maybe even because of our bracha, right? So that's one davar acher, right? I think in some ways, right, like I said, the Midrash is following the form where it starts talking about God, but really it's talking about people. It's also following the form where there's multiple different ideas coming in different ways. And here's another davar acher. Sinai ba kishenigla kadosh baruch hu litena Torah hirish kol ha'olam al yoshvav. Right? The whole, I really messed this up again. Fine, never mind. God sort of made the whole world kind of, Rosh can be like an earthquake. Kol Hashem al hamayim, it was very loud. Kol Hashem b'koach, botasha ani kapetzu kol ha'omot etzel Bilam. All the nations came to Bilam. Yeah, I'm sorry about the translation, but I'll say it. All the nations came, and Kayla, I'll fix this for you and I'll send you a better one, if that's okay. All the nations came to Bilam, and they said, it seems to us that God is trying to destroy the world, which is what we're going to see. Actually, God is threatening to destroy the world if Bnei Israel don't accept the Torah, according to a different Midrash. But here it's like the other nations who are outside of this experience. The Jews may be having this intense experience, but the other people are like, oh, this is scary for us. In some ways, maybe because we're excluded or because we don't have a path in. And then Bilam explains to them that it's really just God giving the Torah. And then there's sort of the in this imagination, the non-Jews are like, okay, well, we want the Jews to be okay because otherwise the world's going to fall apart. Next thing, the Tamei Rivavot Kodesh, right? He came from the myriads of his holy ones, right? Lo k'midat basar kadosh baruch hu midat basar v'dam. This is a common introduction to these sort of, we always say it's a mashal lamelech, it's an analogy for a king, but oftentimes we also say, well, God is not like humans, right? Midat basar v'adam kishu oseh mishte livno kishu someach Marehu et ginzav, et kol asher lo. Right? Humans, when they make a party, when they marry off their son, they really go all out. One of my students was just telling me they're going to like a 5-day wedding in like Cabo or something, whatever. Okay, it makes sense if you know where I teach, but like, right, like that, like because it's like the wedding of a person who's trying to solidify their status is like, I'm the most important, right? So I guess what I'm saying is this is true even today, right? People like go all out for weddings. Sometimes you don't have to. Hopefully, whatever, we'll see. Maybe my kids will force us to, but we'll try not to. There's a lot of value in modesty and all these things, but like I'm saying, like people are drawn to do stuff like that. But Aval Misha Amar V'Hayalam, but God, Eino Kain Ella V'Atam Rivavot Kodesh. Right? It's not like that. Ella V'Atam Rivavot Kodesh. Here it's like almost like a Midrash Halacha type reading. From some of. Me means not all of, but some of the myriads of the Holy One. Right? Which is the final idea here. I mean, first of all, I skipped some stuff in here, but right. This feels to me connected to what I'm trying to do because it's saying that even though God is coming in from all sides, God is also being intentional about how much God presents, right? Not bringing everything. What's the motive for not bringing everything? It seems to me like that motive is not to overwhelm, potentially, right? That like, or that it doesn't work. They can't accept everything, that God has to already curate, as it were, what God is going to reveal. Right? In the circumstances of the revelation, God has to curate it. And we can ask whether the Torah itself, right, is curated as to be something that we can access, right? But that means that something is a little bit, right? If we go back to the Maharal, the Torah fuses the heaven and the earth. That's true, right? At the same time, does that mean that the Torah, right, in order to be accessible to us, how does the Torah have to, I could say, like, sort of be curated, right, for us? If I can summarize, I guess, from the Sifrei, there's a few things. First of all, the idea of when Moshe describes revelation, there's some idea of multiplicity, which I want to connect to this idea of Moshe going back and forth in the Pshat, right? That there's some way in which it's not just like a face-to-face meeting, right? Like I keep saying, right? It's not just like I come here, you come here, I tell you the thing, right? First of all, there's a go-between. Second of all, it's not just that there's a go-between, there's almost like negotiation or unease or kind of negotiation, not in the sense of like I feel like it's kind of like when you have to like jimmy something to fit into the place where it fits. You can't just like push or it's going to break, but you have to kind of like there's an easing in some way. That's just like the feeling I'm getting. You can disagree or not, right? And it comes from this idea of God is coming from multiple directions. On the one hand, perhaps very overwhelming, but on the other hand, not like just like bowling you over, right? God maybe appears in multiple languages. This revelation is tailor-made for the Jewish people, right? It's scary for others, but for them, they can they have the constitution to accept it, or it's curated for their constitution. And that God is holding back to some degree. On the one hand, God is presenting multiple modalities. On the other hand, God is holding back and not bringing everything because that might be too much. And I guess on that note, I thought of this Midrash. You can go back and look at how Rashi, I think in some ways the idea of like it's there but not fully there is more clear in the Rashi that's based on the Sifrei we just saw. I'll go back in a second. Where am I? On page 2, it starts, right? Hashem, so he quotes this thing, he starts talking about God. Hashem is Sinai ba, right? Yatzali kartam kashabali yatsev, he's like a chatan. Okay, great. The Zerach Masir Mamo, first he offered it to Bnei Esau, Paran, then he went to Bnei Ishmael, and then he came to Israel. Merivavot Kodesh, and he brings us imo miktsat, right? Some of them, but not all of them. Eshtat, again, right, which was written back in the day, black fire and white fire, but it was also given to them out of fire. It's sort of a condensation of the Sifrei. I'm not sure actually how much it is. Let us. I wanted to show this last Rashi, which I've been very attached to since I learned it as a child. Maybe you will be too. Also from just earlier in Devarim, from one of the poetic passages at the end of Devarim. Al goes alav yirachef, right? It's talking about God. God is described as Kenesher or Keno. God is like an eagle as it wakes up its young, or its nest, literally. Al goes alav yirachef. He hovers over its young, or it hovers over its young, if you're describing the eagle, I guess. Eino machbid atzmo alehem. And this is also based on Midrash, but Rashi kind of condenses it. Maybe I predicted that it was going to have only 5 minutes left when I got here. I don't know. So here's a condensed thing. Eino machbid atzmo. He doesn't make himself heavy. Ela mechofef, but rather hovers. By the way, the word yirachef appears, I believe, one other time in Chumash, for the root yirachef.
In Bereshit, when Hashem is creating the world.
Right. Ruach Elokim merachefet al pnei hamayim. God is hovering over the world, which is also super interesting, I think. And this feeling of, or over the water, sorry, this feeling of close but not there, right? If the question is, can God and the lower realms really fuse? Merachefet is like, it's not actually on, it's there, but it's not touching, right, necessarily. So no, Rashi has this very, I think, very evocative phrasing, nogea ve'eno nogea. It's touching, but it's not touching, right? Like the eagle, I don't know, lately I've been seeing a lot of hunting birds. There actually was like an eagle in my neighborhood within the past year, right? But they're very big, right? And their babies are still small because they're babies, and they don't just come and go like plop, right? Because they're heavy. So that's the idea, right? They kind of like, I mean, this is true. Like, I don't know, my daughter's very into birds. I can ask her about this, but right, this is true even now, right? When you see a bird kind of like land somewhere, they kind of like push themselves back with their wings so that they can not just like go plop, right? So that's part of it, right? But it's almost like here, right? Instead of just sort of like plopping onto the nest, it sort of like brushes them, but doesn't brush them. It doesn't actually even fully rest on the nest. So this is like God should. The Almighty, we have not found him to be too powerful. Meaning, right, same as Mibri V'vo Kodesh. God doesn't bring everything. God brings enough, right? God hasn't been overpowering. This is an interpretation of one of the interpretations that I mentioned before of that idea of coming from 4 directions. It could be overwhelming, very immersive, but it could also be this. God didn't come from only one direction, to make it a little easier. Shneimar Hashem Sinai ba v'zerach Masir Elamo, same pasuk. Ofia mehar paran, elokami timan yavo, zo ruach ravid. Right. So he's quoting our Sifrei again, but in a different context, right? Rashi here makes it clear the way Rashi sees it is, right? This is a way to kind of lighten the burden. And I really thought this was kind of a little bit interesting and in contrast to Maharal. If we think of Maharal's vision as like, yeah, if I can recap, I guess briefly, right? And I'll stop so I can see your faces for 2 seconds, or you can see mine. Right. Maharal is kind of right. Everybody notices this thing, which is that going up and going down seem to be motifs in Bereshit Shmot Yud Tet, right? The parak that introduces Matan Torah, there's this back and forth. Literally, Moshe is going back and forth as a go-between between God and the people. The words going up and going down are both describing what Moshe and God are doing, and they're also describing what God is saying. God is saying is going to happen. Don't go up to the mountain, right? There's some kind of, I think, like, there's something that has to be worked through. Maybe that's the way to say it, about going up and going down. Maharal sort of presents this uncomplicated vision of like, yeah, well, that's the point. The Torah is the thing that allows us just to like, up goes down, down goes up, like the end, beautiful. Right. And I think that what I'm trying to show with these midrashim, hopefully with some food for thought, is that it's not that simple, or rather, maybe it is that simple at the end, but the process of getting there is not that simple, right? It's not like, okay, well, God just gave the Torah and now it was one, right? I remember when I think maybe even Nefesh Chaim, which I've never learned actually, right? This idea of like, also based on Midrash, right? God is holding the Luchot on one side, and Moshe or we are holding Luchot on the other side, and the Torah connects us, and we're just like one big happy family. Right? It's not quite like that, because it's also kind of terrifying, right? It could be intensely overwhelming. There's also like some way to which God just can't just like stuff the Torah on you, because the Torah, the Torah maybe is the curated version of God, but God just can't stuff God's whole self on top of you because it's too much, right? God has to curate what God is going to bring to the table, and the people have to prepare themselves to be able to receive even that. So perhaps that's kind of the nice way to begin this exploration, is the idea that whatever we're going to say later, if we're going to look at other midrashim about Moshe went up to heaven and he saw God doing X, Y, Z, and then they had this conversation, which sort of imply a level of intimacy and familiarity, and we want to then sort of like think about them as metaphors for our life. There's some sense in which the Torah itself and the midrashim are very, very aware also that this process is uneasy and challenging, could be overwhelming. And I think we can read all the other stories that they tell as a response to that as well. Sort of like, how are, right, given the fact that maybe you can't receive everything from God at once, God has to curate what God is bringing. What are the things that are on the table and how are they being negotiated? So thanks so much for coming. It's been a pleasure. And I hope I'll see many of you next week.
Thank you, everyone.
And I guess I can stick around for questions if needed, but.
Oh, and I'm sorry, Evelyn, I think I missed a comment of yours pointing out, I think this was about 10 minutes ago or so, that B'nai Israel did take up arms many times in the Torah narratives.
Yeah, I think I tried to address that, but thank you.
All right, okay, just want to make sure that came about. It's been pretty quiet in the Zoom, not in the Zoom chat, in the Facebook chat, so no questions, pass on from there.
Okay.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
And there are more classes
Thanks for your thoughts and comments.
for Drisha as part of Shir Zvan. You can find out and sign up at drisha.org/classes. Take care, everyone. Goodbye.
Bye.